Okay.
Oh, we're recording. Okay, great. Then I'll check in with you before 8.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you. Hey, Joe, you there? Hello. Oh, are you there? I don't hear you. Joe. Hey, Joe.
Hey there.
Oh, hey, there you are. How are you?
Okay. How are you?
Good. Can you just quickly spotlight me? I just want to check out my camera one last time.
Okay, I think I'm.
Oh, there we go. Good. So I'm, whoops, that's not right. There. So now I'm vertical.
You're vertical?
Good. And now I'm horizontal.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Let me just check the camera's flip-flop. Good. And yeah, I don't seem to have the zoom feature. Let me keep trying. Let me go back and try a couple things. See if I can get that zoom feature going. And I'm back. Do you know how I can get the zoom feature going?
This is just on your phone, right?
Yeah, I just want to get the zoom feature on it. Any ideas?
No.
Okay, let me try a couple things. Should only take a couple seconds. And am I spotlighted?
You are spotlighted.
Okay. Can you try unspotlighting me and then spotlighting me again? Is this unspotlighted?
That's unspot.
Okay. Now can you spotlight me again? Is
There's
this spotlight?
spotlight. Yep.
Okay, good. And I'm vertical?
Yes.
Excellent. And I'm horizontal?
Yes.
Excellent. Now let me try to see if I can get that zoom feature back. Oh, no, can't seem to get it. What is that about? Okay. Should I sign back out and sign back in? You want to try that? Yeah.
You could try that. You could try that.
Okay. Can you send me another invitation, please? Tell me when you've done that. Yeah, you've done that?
Here we go. I'm going to send it to you.
Okay. Has that been sent?
No.
Okay, thank you. Let me know when it is.
Okay, just got sent.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to check it out and sign back in. Thanks, Joe. I'm going to leave. All right, excellent. Hey there.
Hey.
Hey, and can you spotlight me again?
Okay.
Great. And can you make sure my name's changed?
It's changed.
Okay, excellent. So I'm vertical.
You are vertical.
And I'm horizontal.
Horizontal.
Okay, now I don't see my face in the little face. Is that okay?
You don't see your face where?
I have two faces, and the one in the upper right-hand corner usually has my face, but not this time. Is that okay?
Guess must be okay because you're
okay.
Looking good.
I'm spotlight. Okay, good. So now I'm going to try my, okay, there's the zoom. Okay, good. So I've got that feature back. Excellent. And the video is good?
Video's good.
And the sound quality is good?
Sound is good.
Okay, great. So thank you everybody for joining us. That was just a quick tech catch up. So we'll begin in just a little bit. Thanks again for being here. Hello, my name is John Fisher, and this is the Fillmore. A few weeks ago, I went outside of my house for the first time in months during COVID-19. I had not been outside since shelter in place began. The thing is I used to go outside at night all the time because I'm an actor and a director and a playwright. So I was working in the theater. I had to go outside and rehearse and perform 5-6 nights a week. But then suddenly, shelter in place happened, no more live performance, and here I was, inside every night. It was kind of wonderful, a great change for me. But then I took a show outside. What I did was I left this apartment and I went up the hill behind my house. I went south from my home to explore the hills of the Haight-Ashbury. But tonight, I'm gonna go in the other direction. I'm gonna go north. I'm gonna leave here, ride through the Haight-Ashbury, then to the Panhandle, then to Nopa, and then up the hill to Turk Street, and then down to the Divisadero, and then to Alamo Square, and finally, the Fillmore. I'm taking an adventure north of my household out into COVID-19, my second time out of the house at night since the onset of shelter in place. But this isn't just a story of my neighborhood. It's also a story of my good friend, June. June, who I met at UC Berkeley. She was an incredibly talented costume designer and artist. Here's a piece of her art. It's right here in my apartment. You can see it. We've got it right over our doorway. There it is, an original work of art by June. That is a detail of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with God reaching out to Adam, creating Adam, the first man. June painted that, but when she returned to Singapore, where she was from, she couldn't take it with her because it was too big, and she didn't think it would fit on the plane, so she left it with me. I'm hoping one day that she can come back and get it. Not that I don't want it, I'd love to have it forever, but more than that, I'd love to see June, because June meant so much to me. You see, my husband and I have lived here forever, and when I was in graduate school, I met many wonderful people, and June was one of them. She was terrific. Here's a picture of June. Joe, can you show us the picture of June? There it is. That's a Durham Studio Theater, the best theater ever. And that's on the UC Berkeley campus. And there I am sitting with June, conferring during a rehearsal. She was always so helpful during rehearsal. I loved working with June. And this is a typical picture of us in rehearsal, sitting there in an empty house, talking about what was going on stage. My costume designer, assistant director, and all-around good guy, artistic advisor. Thanks, Joe. That was terrific. So now we're going to head out into the night. But like last time, we have to be careful. We have to be cautious. So the protective devices. I'm taking my backpack with me. Now my backpack has my wallet in it. A wallet is very important because if I get in an accident, the first thing the paramedics are going to do is what's called a wallet biopsy. They're going to look in my wallet to make sure that I've got health coverage. And if I do, then they'll save me. So I got to have my wallet. Also, I'm taking my keys because I want to lock up my apartment. As I said before, I live here with my husband of 35 years. I don't want somebody breaking in here and taking him away. He's a wonderful guy and very special. I love him, so I'm going to lock him up in this apartment for security. Also, I'm taking my headset. Now my headset allows me to talk to you while I'm on my bicycle. Here it is, my bicycle headset. This is the mouthpiece. Hey, I've got my bicycle outfit on. Yay! I never wear a bicycle outfit. But like last time I told you, I bought this because I knew you expected a costume. So now I look like a bicyclist. I ride my bike every day in jeans and a t-shirt. But now I look official, like one of those tight clothes bicycle people. So now I'm all set to plug in. But first, I'm going to put on my COVID-19 mask to protect me as I go out into COVID-19. See, all secure behind my red bandana. And finally, my helmet. Now, as I said last time, I had a friend in high school, and her mother used to say to her, "Oh, you're going to ride your bike and not wear a helmet? How nice of you. The doctors are going to be so pleased because when your head gets smashed and you're brain dead, your organs will be donated to science and people who need an organ donor. That's so generous of you. You'll be an organ donor because you're not wearing a helmet on your bike." Well, I don't want to be an organ donor, So I'm going to wear my helmet. So now I'm all ready to go out into COVID-19, my second night out into the world since shelter in place on March 19th. Now I'm going to plug in so that you can hear me. Now I'm plugged in my phone, so I'm coming to you through my little microphone right here, somewhere underneath. Uh-oh, it's caught in a little clasp. Can't have that. That might cut off all my narrative. Let me buckle up again. So I'm safe, but still audible. There we go. Now I'm under the clasp. Excellent. So now let's take you off this pole in my hallway and put you onto my bicycle, which will be our transportation method for tonight. Here's my bicycle. I'm going to put you all on board. How about that? You're now on my bicycle, and we're all going out into COVID-19 together. Now I'm going to turn on my headlight, which blinks. There, you see it blinking for safety, so that we're all safe on the bike. And my backlight, which you can kind of see blinking. Well, that's the front light, but there's a red light back. Take my word for it. Okay, here we go, out into the night. Now remember that this is live. So if something goes wrong, or if the tape gets a little bit behind me, don't get impatient. It'll catch up with me. I'll be there soon enough. Don't worry, you haven't missed much. Okay, so stay with us as we venture out into COVID-19 live on a headset and a phone. Here we go. And if I disappear suddenly, don't panic. I'll be back, I promise. Now we're out in my hallway. I'm going to lock up my husband. Now this might sound like it's not very PC, locking up your husband, but I've got a great husband. I love him. And I don't want somebody to come here and grab him while I'm gone and take him away. That would really upset me. So I'm going to lock him up. Husband all locked up, and we are ready to go. Yay! I have a lot of expressions, but they're not going to be visible because I'm under my COVID-19 mask. Here we go, out into the night. Now, June and I met at UC Berkeley. I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, studying to become a playwright, director, and actor. And June came from Singapore. She came all the way to UC Berkeley for study 2 years. This was in mid-90s. Here we are out on the street. So now we're going to head out down past Haight Street, which is in front of us. All set to go? Here we go. Right. Culture. And she was raised conservative Christian. But almost immediately, she was thrilled by everything she found in Berkeley. And when she started doing costumes for me, she proved that she wasn't uptight about the surroundings at all. She loved gay men and lesbian women. She thought it was so exciting. Things she had never been around in Singapore suddenly were surrounding her all the time. And June wasn't just a great costume designer, she was a brilliant theater collaborative artist. Here we've come to our first stop. This is what's called a slow street. I'll show it to you. They might have these in your community. They're all over San Francisco now. You see the sign? It's a slow street. Now, theoretically, this street is dedicated only to bicyclists and pedestrians during COVID-19. And for the most part, you see, there's only people crossing the street. There's nobody actually on the street. Well, that was sort of a motorized vehicle, but people are doing pretty well. Uh-oh, here comes another car. I bet that person lives here. That's how it's supposed to work. Now we're coming up on a row of Victorians. This is a story about imperialism in San Francisco. It's also a story about Victorians. Now, everybody loves Victorians now. They're the favorite of everyone. And here is a majestic row right down the street from my house. You can see them there, marching down the street, silhouetted against the night sky. Beautiful, all painted different colors, spectacular. Now everybody loves Victorians now.
But there was a time when people hated them. The 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were considered fire traps, overcrowded, crowded together, and people, many people, wanted them destroyed. And that is the story of urban renewal in San Francisco, a story about the poor Victorians getting attacked. But it's also a story of imperialism in this city. We're now coming up on the Panhandle. The Panhandle is a long, skinny park, a block wide, in the middle of San Francisco. It connects to the Pan. The Pan is Golden Gate Park. Now, in 1870, a man named Hall, his name was Hall, decided that he wanted to develop the outer parts of the city. The outer parts being anything from Van Ness out. That was all called the Great Sand Bank, because from Van Ness out, all there was sand. Sand blowing in the wind. Think Lawrence of Arabia, the Sahara Desert. Do, 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 do. Yes, indeed. That's the music from Lawrence of Arabia. That's what it was like out here. But Hall realized that if he built parks out here, he could attract people to come live here. He could then lay trolley cars that were towed by horses on tracks, and people would come out here because of the parks, and then people would buy the property and build houses. He was a developer. Hall first had to figure out how to stabilize the sand dunes because he couldn't build a park on top of shifting sand dunes. So what did he do? He tried a variety of different grasses. He tried growing grasses on the sand dunes. Finally, he found grasses that held on the sand dunes. And what that meant was the sand dunes would not shift in the wind. Once he had stabilized the sand dunes, he started building trees, planting trees in the sand dunes. Now, what he wanted were trees with shallow roots and a high foliage above ground. Big trees with shallow roots, those would grow best in the sand dunes. He chose cypress, pines, and eucalyptus trees. And that's what you see now in the Panhandle, are these majestic trees. It was a massive success. Then he moved on to Golden Gate Park. Since he had stabilized this part of the park, he could then move on to planting Golden Gate Park. It was a huge success. Now, what happened in the 50s and 60s was the car generation hit. And under President Eisenhower and others, everybody wanted to build highways everywhere. Well, immediately, the government, federal, state, and city, wanted to build a huge highway right through the middle of the Panhandle. Well, the people were in revolt. And this was one of the first of the highway revolts. Revolts against the government, people saying they would not let a highway ruin their wonderful community. It was successful. And as a result, the streets on either side of the Panhandle, Fell and Oak, were widened, but a huge freeway was not built through the Panhandle and Golden Gate Park. Why would they want a freeway? To get people from the outer neighborhoods and from the suburbs to the Civic Center and downtown San Francisco. Now we're coming up on a huge monument. It is our first monument of imperialism. It is a gigantic statue dedicated to the memory of the first great imperialist president in the United States, President William McKinley. He ruled, or I should say he was president, from 1897 to 1901. And he was responsible for the first great acts of imperialism in this country. After 1865, at the end of the Civil War, people weren't interested in the rest of the world. Americans wanted to make sure that America was peaceful. But in 1898, the Spanish were being cruel to the Cubans on the island of Cuba in the middle of the Caribbean. As a result, America, acting like a big brother, told Spain to lay off the Cubans. And a war started brewing. War wasn't declared yet, and then the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. So here we see this massive statue to William McKinley. And let's see if we can zoom in. Well, we can't quite zoom in, but you can get a sense of it, even in the dark. There it is. It looms above us. On top of it is a gigantic woman. She is based on the real person, Alma de Bretteville. And there you begin to see her huge palm raised into the air above the trees. That is the palm of peace, which is ironic because William McKinley was famous for instigating the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War. Now you can just barely see William McKinley's medallion right there. You see it? That's William McKinley. This is a memorial to him because he was killed by an assassin in 1901. Well, as the 1898 war was heating up with the Spanish, and really this was a war about protecting American interests, and it was instigated by the great newspaper tycoon, William Randolph Hearst, and his yellow journalism directed against Spain so that America could expand its influence. Now, the government didn't always know what to do. They were nervous, so they didn't immediately declare war. In fact, they weren't even sure that they should put the military on a footing ready for war. So what'd they do? Secretary Long of the Navy went away for the weekend, and the fleets had not been alerted. But his assistant Secretary of the Navy, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, sent a cable to Admiral Dewey of the US Pacific Fleet. He told Admiral Dewey to get ready. He told him to take the US Pacific Fleet from Nagasaki in Japan to Hong Kong, which was only 600 miles from Manila in the Philippines. The reason for this was Theodore Roosevelt wanted the US Navy to seize the Philippines for the United States. He told Admiral Dewey to get ready, that the second he heard that there was a declaration of war, to take the fleet to Manila and seize the Philippines for the United States. Now, he wasn't really supposed to do this, Theodore Roosevelt, because he was only the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Secretary of the Navy Long was out of town, but he did it anyway. He took the initiative because he wanted to seize the Philippines for the United States. When Secretary Long and President McKinley got back into town, they didn't rescind the order, but they thought, wow, that was pretty bold. Anyway, when war was finally declared, Admiral Dewey left from Hong Kong, sailed to Manila, defeated the Spanish fleet, and seized the Philippines for the United States. By the end of the war with Spain, the United States had gained the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, and the same year they annexed Hawaii to the United States. Thus, the great victory of Theodore Roosevelt. In 1901, President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, and Theodore Roosevelt came here in 1903 and dedicated this monumental statue to the memory of the first great imperialist, William McKinley. There are many acts of imperialism in San Francisco, not just international ones, like the ones that got us the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and influencing Cuba, but also national ones, things that only happened in our country. One of those were the rail barons. And right across the street here is the Southern Pacific Hospital. You can see it right there in front of us, this majestic hospital. This hospital stretches from one corner to another. It's a full block long. The Southern Pacific was an imperialist on the continent of the United States, of Northern America. They built the Southern Pacific Railway, Transcontinental Railway, and seized land all along the way from the indigenous people. They became rich, and instead of providing insurance for their people, like Kaiser, they just built their own hospital. And this is their hospital, this majestic structure, a full block long and deep. It fills a solid block. It is the oldest hospital in San Francisco. It was built in 1908. Well, as it turned out, by 1968, Southern Pacific no longer needed the hospital. So they left it. It was abandoned for a few years. And then, covered with graffiti, it was bought on the cheap by Mercy Housing. And it is now a facility for retired people. Subsidized housing for retired people. It features prominently in the wonderful film noir DOA, Dead on Arrival. This is a terrific B-grade film noir starring the incredible Edmund O'Brien, one of my all-time favorites. If you haven't seen him in 7 Days in May, you have not lived You must see Edmund O'Brien in 7 Days in May. But he's also terrific in DOA, which is set at this hospital. So here's what happens. At the beginning of DOA, Edmund O'Brien enters this hospital. He is told that he's got 24 hours to live. In that 24 hours, he's got to figure out who poisoned him and why, because the poison is working through his body. And 24 hours later, he solves the mystery of who poisoned him and why, and he gets revenge, and then he dies in this hospital. If you look down the street, you'll see some Victorians. Let me see if I can zoom in. Oh, can't seem to zoom in, but that's okay. Let me try this. Whoop. Whoop. Okay, well, you can see them down there in the distance. These are what beautiful San Francisco Victorians look like. And across the street is a phony Victorian. You see, it's got the bay windows and everything, but it's not a real Victorian. You see a lot of Victorians burn, and then they get replaced with these phony Victorians. The lesson is that Victorians get taken care of by earthquakes and fires at an alarming rate. So we don't need to add to the Victorian destruction by also destroying them for redevelopment. This piece, to some extent, is about the imperialism of redevelopment. I'm now riding on Baker Street. Baker Street represents the end of the Panhandle, the PA in NOPA. Well, if the Panhandle ends there and Divisadero is 2 blocks to my right, how on earth can Divisadero be considered NOPA? It's not. It's 2 blocks from the Panhandle. So that's a misnomer. Divisadero is not part of NOPA. Across the street here, you can see a Victorian. Now, many Victorian houses out here in this part of the city fell into a disfashionable category after the Second World War. The only way that they could survive is by becoming either institutions or apartment buildings. This one became a meditation center. Right next to it is a building by James Dunn, one of my favorite San Francisco architects. He also happens to be the architect of the building that my husband Michael and I live in. So now we're going to cross and look at another fascinating building coming up on the left by another one of my favorite San Francisco architects. June was a terrific collaborator. She knew how to look at a show and give feedback on anything: acting, directing, playwriting, design. So not only was she a terrific costume designer, she was an amazing artistic collaborator. The funnest part of working with her, though, is to see her discover all the amazing things in Berkeley that were not a part of her life in Singapore. Open ideas about sexuality, gender, culture, identity. These are all things she hadn't grown up with, and she loved them. She had found herself in Berkeley, working with all of us, creating queer theater. Working with June was one of my most fruitful artistic collaborations. That's why her not being here anymore is very sad to me. This ride reminds me a lot of June, because she and I used to walk all over this part of the city. My husband, Michael, introduced me to this city, and while he was working during the day, she used to come and visit me, and I would show it all to her. Here we are on the left at the Native Daughters of the Golden West. This is a terrific building built by Julia Morgan. She designed this building. Now, what I love about Julia Morgan's architecture is it's so eclectic. Look at that, spectacular. Now, one thing that you have to see in close-up, so I'll just walk over here. I don't have my close-up feature tonight, but I can just walk around carrying my bike. That's fine. Is these wonderful New Orleans balconies. Julia Morgan would do anything. She would put anything on a building because she celebrated architecture in all its forms. Also, above the door, you see an American flag crest. And then right there, next to the American flag, you see a bear, the California bear. Isn't that wonderful? The California bear on this wonderful building by Julia Morgan. There's another bear way up at the top in between those 2 flags. You could just barely see it at the base of the flags. I love Julia Morgan's architecture. Now, she's probably most famous for the house she designed for William Randolph Hearst. Yes, the same man who was responsible for the yellow journalism that started the Spanish-American War that we were just talking about. That's his house in San Simeon. But I always loved best the buildings she made for women's organizations in San Francisco and Berkeley. I always thought that they're her best buildings because she was given unlimited freedom as a designer. They're really quite special. Most of them for the YWCAs around the Bay Area. You can see them in Chinatown and in Oakland. So now we're headed up the hill to our next stop. And to introduce you to a tenant of one of these apartments, an unwilling tenant, Joe, could you show us the picture of Tanya, please? There she is. That is Tanya. Remember this? This appeared on the front page of the Chronicle in the 70s. It said, "I've joined the SLA." That is Patty Hearst. Look at that machine gun. And that is the SLA symbol behind her. Thank you, Joe. Patty Hearst was a student at UC Berkeley, where I went to school. She was kidnapped from UC Berkeley by the SLA, the Simonese Liberation Army. She was then taken to Daly City. Then she was moved to a safe house on Masonic. I took you there last time, the safe house on Masonic of the SLA. And finally, she was brought to Golden Gate Avenue, right here in San Francisco. And at 1127 Golden Gate, in apartment number 6, she was kept for several weeks. She was locked in a closet. All 11 members of the SLA were in there with her, not in the closet, in the apartment. And they held her for many weeks. Now, what did the SLA want? Why did they kidnap Patty Hearst, relative of William Randolph Hearst, relative of his grandson, who was very rich? Why did they kidnap her? Well, they wanted the police to release 2 SLA members who had been responsible for the murder of Marcus Foster, a school superintendent from Oakland. Well, the police refused, so they made another demand. And here we are at 1127 Golden Gate. And in apartment number 6 in this building, Patty Hearst was held. There it is. Somebody lives in there. Somebody has their clothes hung up in the closet in number 6, which is where Patty Hearst was held for weeks and weeks and weeks. When she came out, she had succumbed to Stockholm Syndrome. And she had become a member of the SLA. That's when her picture appeared as Tanya. I've joined the SLA. Well, back to when she was first kidnapped, the SLA didn't get what they wanted. People who were in jail for killing Marcus Foster demand. They wanted Patty's father, Mr. Hearst, to spend $2 million, $2 million, providing groceries for the poor of the Bay Area. And he actually tried to do it, but it quickly degenerated into riots and confusion. It was very badly organized, and people got upset. Some people didn't even need the groceries, and the rioting was an embarrassment. Patty said in a communique from the SLA, "Dad, what a disaster." Patty, now a member of the SLA, was involved in a bank robbery, the Hibernia Bank out in the avenues. And when she finally was released from captivity, she was tried as an accessory to a felony. And she actually served some time in jail. Now, the head of the SLA was a man named Sin Q. Sin Q got his name from Sin K. Sin K was a West Africa man who in 1839 was abducted from West Africa with a lot of other West Africans as a part of the illegal Atlantic slave trade. He was abducted by Spanish people who put him on the Amistad and brought him to the Caribbean, where he would be sold as a slave. Well, the treatment of the people from West Africa was brutal. Many on the ship were killed, beaten, abused, and halfway across the Atlantic, Cinque led a revolt against the Spanish sailors. He seized control of the ship. 2 of the sailors were killed. 2 of the West African men were killed. And he ordered the living Spanish sailors to take him back to West Africa, him and the other West Africans. Well, the Spanish sailors deceived him. They seemed to be taking him back to Africa, but in fact, they sailed around for weeks and finally ended up in Connecticut, where Cinque and the other West Africans were seized by the Americans and put on trial. The court case was finally appealed to the United States Supreme Court in 1839. It was United States versus La Amistad. And the United States Supreme Court found in favor of the West Africans and against the Spaniards, accusing them of illegally trafficking in slaves, for it was illegal, the Atlantic slave trade. And they were ordered returned to West Africa. Cinque gave his name to Cinque, head of the SLA. Cinque would die in a massive shootout in LA after the Patty Hearst kidnapping. Now, this is a very interesting movie that was based on all this, called Amistad, directed by Steven Spielberg. And the most interesting thing to me about it is that a gay man, an openly gay man, played the only American president who was purportedly gay. Nigel Hawthorne, an openly gay actor, played President Martin Van Buren, who was suspected of being gay. It's the first time an openly gay actor had ever played a possibly gay president. Unfortunately, he's not a very sympathetic president because he was on the side of the Spaniards, the illegal slave traffickers. So Martin Van Buren is not the most sympathetic person, but he might have been a gay president, and Nigel Hawthorne played him in this movie. We've now arrived at Turk Street, and above me is a church. This is the St. John Coltrane Church. In 1965, Franzo and Marina King came to the United States for their first wedding anniversary. They went to hear John Coltrane play at a jazz club in San Francisco. They were transfixed. It was amazing, his work on the saxophone. There was something spiritual, religious about it. They were amazed. They called it their soul baptism. So enthralled with it were they that they started a church group. And in 1967, when John Coltrane died, very young in his early, they started the John Coltrane Church. And this is it, St. John Coltrane Church. There you see it, right there. The St. John Coltrane Church. They said there was something spiritual about his music. He had said the same thing. Dr. Martin Luther King said the same thing about jazz. It had a spiritual component. So they started this incredible church. This church is world famous. It's been written up in the New Yorker magazine and the New York Times. People come from all over the world to attend services here. And Bishop King gives the liturgy and intersperses it with solos on the soprano saxophone. You're encouraged to bring your instruments and participate. This is an incredibly popular church. Now, John Coltrane said that he believed in all religions, and this church building certainly carries that out. It echoes that sentiment, because here you see, also a tenant of this building is the Sophia in Trinity Church, an inclusive Roman Catholic community. And if that isn't enough, the third tenant of this church is St. Cyprian's Episcopal Church, Faith, Action, Community. Amazing. Now, all of Franzo and Marina King's children are involved in this church. In fact, our next stop, which is KPOO Radio, KPOO radio, just down the street, is the location of a weekly broadcast, Uplift, which is a broadcast from the community of the John Coltrane Church. Joe, can you show us some of the John Coltrane icons? This is a John Coltrane Church icon. Isn't that wonderful? Reminds me of Russian icons. I just love the inclusion of the instrument and the noble sentiment. These are wonderful, and they're available on the John Coltrane Church website. We're now headed down Turk Street to Divisadero. Thank you, Joe. So June worked on plays with us. We loved working with June. We're a tight-knit group, gay men, lesbian women, bisexual people telling gay, lesbian, and bi stories. June was at the center of it. Everybody loved June. She was at the core of the artistic collaboration. Two of my primary collaborators were Corey and Paul. Corey is a terrific actor, playwright, and director, and Paul was a wonderful actor. The four of us were great friends. Now, if you look in front of me at the end of Turk Street, you'll see beautiful downtown San Francisco. There it is, way off in the distance. You see the blue of the Salesforce Tower, and right beside it, a big heart SF. What a wonderful sentiment in the middle of COVID-19. So let's keep heading down Turk Street. So all of us involved in this group were fast friends. Now the problem was that June had only come to school here for 2 years. And once June graduated, she wouldn't be able to stay any longer. Once she'd gone through a graduation ceremony, she would be given only 1 year to work in the United States, and then she would have to go back to Singapore. That's what her visa said. Just before she graduated, her brother came to visit with his wife. Now, June was very nervous because she knew that she would have to ask her brother for money, but she was afraid that he would disapprove of her lifestyle, her inclusive, culturally diverse lifestyle in Berkeley. She wanted her brother to meet all of us because we were her friends, but she was concerned about the impression we might make on him and the influence he had over her life with her parents and with himself. She said she wasn't going to bring him to see one of the plays, and she wasn't going to bring him to rehearsal, but she wanted him to meet me because she considered me her mentor. I said, yes, of course, I'd be happy to. And I knew to be discreet because I knew that he had a lot to do with whether or not she'd be able to stay for an extra year after she graduated. He was a very nice man, but he was obviously very conservative and a little nervous in the excitement and, quote, licentiousness, unquote, of Berkeley. But I saw he was a good guy and that he loved June. They were both, as I said, raised conservative Christian. And although June was changing a bit, he obviously was very much a Christian man, embarking on the life of a conservative Christian with his young wife. June and I, at this time, took a dance class together. I took it because I was turning 30 years old and I felt really old. I felt ancient at 30. I felt like this ancient guy. So I took a dance class to get back in touch with my body. June took the dance class because she was in love with one of the other dancers, a female. So even as she was about to graduate, she was discovering that she had feelings for women also. I attribute that proudly to Berkeley and the influence it had had on her. We're now headed down to Divisadero. Divisadero used to be a street full of businesses that were owned by African Americans. It has more and more become gentrified, and the businesses are more and more owned by non-African American people. The tenor and the feel of the community has changed radically over the last 25 years. We're coming up on KPOO radio. KPOO, the POO stands for Poor People's Radio. It was founded in 1971. Now, the purpose of KPOO radio was to provide a radio voice for the activist community. It was a radio station, one of the first in the country, where you could hear national and local African-American politicians talking about national and local African-American issues. But it wasn't just an African-American community radio. It was also interested, and continues to be interested in providing a voice for Arab American voices, Latinx voices, LGBT voices, the great diversity of this part of the city. KPOO radio has always provided coverage for Theodore Rhinoceros shows. It is run entirely by volunteers, and the volunteers are allowed to play whatever music they want. The music choices are not dictated by the publishers like other radio stations, and the content of the individual programs is not censored. It is an important part of this community. It is the first radio station on the West Coast to play rap music and to have rap artists on it being interviewed. It's also one of the first radio stations anywhere to play salsa and reggae music. Marilyn Foster has a radio show on KPOO, and she is a wonderful singer and actress, and she has always dedicated herself to covering the work of the LGBT theater community. So let's take a look at KPOO radio. There we have this mural, which shows you some of the jazz history from this neighborhood. Even children playing the sax. And there it is, KPOO radio. Poor people's radio. Not poor in thoughts or ideas. A radio station for the people since 1971. Now, at the other end of Divisadero is a salon called Medusalon. Medusalon is at 300 Divisadero. Medusalon has been there for a long time, and it just announced that it was going out of business. And it is the last African-American owned business on Divisadero. That is it. The owner said that she could no longer afford to pay the upkeep. She can't pay the rent. It's gone up and up and up. And she can't pay the electricity and the water, which even during COVID-19 is not put on hold. She talked to the landlord, but he said no deal. So she's shutting down the business. She's been a resident of this neighborhood for 25 years. So here's a mural which celebrates Billie Holiday. And you see that beside her, it says, the Harlem of the West. And then down there, we see more and more jazz musicians, Dizzy Gillespie and many others. That's what this neighborhood was called, the Harlem of the West, extending from here down to Fillmore Street and into the Western Addition. A mural celebrating the profound jazz legacy of this community. So, Medusalon is going out of business. It's the last African-American owned business on Divisadero. Gentrification in this part of the city. We're going to turn left up here to see the oldest church building in San Francisco. This is St. Patrick's Church. It was originally located at Market and New Montgomery. It was built in 1851. And because of development downtown, it could either be torn down or moved. So it was moved out here. And when it was moved here, it was moved into the sand dunes. Yes, there's nothing out here but sand dunes. And St. Patrick's Church was relocated to the sand dunes. Right beside it is this massive church built in the early part of the 20th century. There we go. You can see it right there beside it. And now we're coming up on St. Patrick's Church, built in 1851, the oldest church in the city, now relocated And now, the art gallery of the Mekong Monastery. There it is, St. Patrick's Church. Magnificent. It was once in the sand dunes, but now it's surrounded by a massive church from the early part of the 20th century and housing. And you begin to see that this housing across the street from me is not old. It's not Victorians. There were once Victorians here, as old as this church, some of them. But the days of Victorians were numbered in this part of the city, the Western Addition. We're now headed back up to Divisadero. So, June was falling in love with a girl, which was great. We were all so proud of her. But was that really the kind of thing she'd come to Berkeley to learn? Well, in our view, yes, we loved it. But what would she be able to do along those lines back in Singapore? It was impossible. June graduated, and she had a year to work. Now, one thing she really wanted to do was live in San Francisco. She had read so much about San Francisco in the books Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin, and she also loved the TV series of Tales of the City. She loved Armistead Maupin's stories of inclusivity and cultural diversity amongst gays, lesbians, bis, and even straight people. She loved those books, and her dream was to live in San Francisco. Now, Corey, that artist I mentioned before, who I loved working with, wanted to live in San Francisco too, specifically in the Castro. Why the Castro? Because Corey was coming out of the closet and he wanted to experience the gay capital. So Corey was going to get an apartment in the Castro, and June decided to live with him. They got the cutest little apartment on Liberty Street on the Castro Hill. And June was blissful because she got a job at Berkeley Repertory Theater working in the box office. I was so proud of her. Everybody loved June. She was a great person. I think the key to June was not only was she a lot of fun, had a great sense of humor and great intelligence, but she was so thrilled by the discovery of so many new things in the United States. As I said, she came from an incredibly conservative culture, had been raised conservative Christian, and she came here and embraced everything. She never said no. I mean, she didn't like crimes or anything. She didn't do things illegal, but she loved the diversity of the Bay Area, and she embraced it wholeheartedly. So every day, she'd leave her apartment, go down to Castro Street, catch the Muni Underground, take it to BART, and ride BART over to Berkeley. Everybody in Berkeley loved her, and she loved working at Berkeley Rep. And she did that for a year. Then she'd come back to San Francisco and work on plays with us. And like I said, not just costume design. She helped me direct. She helped me write. She was always giving feedback. She was such a sensitive artist. It's sort of a golden time for all of us, and June was right at the center of it. Now, as we head on to Divisadero, we're going up a hill. This is sort of the high part of the Western Addition. Remember, this was all sand dunes at one point, but people like Hall building the park and a lot of other developers putting transportation out here allowed this to become an area that was developed with a lot of beautiful Victorian houses. June was still facing her dilemma. As the clock ticked by, she knew she'd have to do something, because after a year, she'd be illegal. What was she going to do? Well, we wanted to help her. As it turns out, one of our friends was an immigration attorney. We arranged for free to have him talk to her about her options of staying in the United States past the year deadline, which was approaching. She talked to him, and then she reported back to us the upshot of the conversation. It wasn't good news. He said the only thing you can do to protect yourself from arrest by the INS was on the last day of your visa to go to the airport, buy a ticket, and return to Singapore. Well, if you want to do the safest thing, always talk to an attorney. I really believe that. It wasn't what we hoped for, certainly wasn't what June hoped for, but it was the fact of the matter that once her visa was up, and it would soon be up, she would have to go back to Singapore to be safe. She could be arrested by INS. Well, the due date approached, and suddenly she was illegally in this country. There was no immediate result. It's not like INS sought her out and arrested her. That didn't happen. We never thought it would. But she immediately lost her job at Berkeley Rep. They couldn't afford legally to employ her if she didn't have a visa. She managed to find small jobs doing this and that, creative jobs. It was hard to believe that she'd ever be able to string it all together. And she was always mindful of what the immigration attorney, our friend, had said to her. The best and safest thing she could do was go to the airport, buy a ticket, and go back to Singapore. I now headed up Fulton Street. Fulton Street is a major artery from the Civic Center all the way out to the Richmond. It goes from City Hall to the University of San Francisco. The University of San Francisco is a Jesuit university. At one time, it was considered to be basically a Catholic Irish university. And because the Catholic Irish dominated City Hall and the civil service, the best thing to do if you wanted to be a civil servant or work in government or be a politician was to go to USF. And they used to say, what you should do, go to USF, and when you get your degree, there's USF in the distance, that little gold tower. Go to USF, and when you get your bachelor's degree, get on the 5 Fulton bus line, which runs right on this street, ride the 5 Fulton all the way downtown to City Hall, there in the distance. You can just see it. It has red, white, and blue markings tonight. Get on the bus, ride it down to City Hall, and get your job at City Hall. Degree at USF, bus ride all the way down to City Hall at the end of Fulton Street. Now, right here across the street is the Westerfield House, this spectacular Victorian. Let's walk close. I can't zoom in, but I can walk close. I'm my own zoom feature. There it is, the Westerfield House, this magnificent Victorian. This house is famed because it appears in Tom Wolfe's Haight-Ashbury masterpiece, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. It also was the home of filmmaker Kenneth Anger, who lived there in the 1960s. Now, I've always loved Kenneth Anger, not for his films, but for his amazing book, Hollywood Babylon. I'd love to think that he was working on Hollywood Babylon when he lived in this beautiful house in San Francisco. If you haven't read Hollywood Babylon, it is the trashiest, most wonderful, lurid book ever written. I love it, love it, love it. All of the secret, disgusting sex lives of the movie stars. We're now entering Alamo Square, which is at the top of the Western Addition, this neighborhood that would succumb to a kind of imperialism. Now, a few weeks ago, I took everybody on a walk of death. Yes, a walk of death in Buena Vista Park. Oh my goodness. Well, I'm not sure you can see this, but here it is again, the spectacular downtown San Francisco. Yep, there it is. Look close. And then cutting through the trees, just barely there, right in the middle of the shot, you can see the moon looming over San Francisco. Let's see if we can get closer. Alamo Square is also a walk of death. Why do I say that? Because the first night that I came here, I was rehearsing this piece. They had a COVID-19 party, a rave in the middle of Alamo Square. Incredible. Right here, with searchlights combing the sky, was a big crowd of people, no masks, no social distancing, having a rave. It was amazing. And they weren't shy about it. Everybody was dancing right here where I'm riding my bike. Well, everybody's got their own response to all this. It did look very scary, and that's why I call this another walk o' death. Also, as with the other walk of death, you never know what could happen in a San Francisco park. There are wild coyotes in these parks. Coyotes, yes. And also, since the onset of COVID-19, a lot of very nice middle-class people have been coming into the park and drinking in public. Now, when a nice middle-class person has a couple glasses of wine, capable of anything. So this, too, is right here in front of me. Is one of the most famous pieces. Absolutely incredible. These Victorians in front of me are known as the painted ladies. Let me get a little closer. And there, over the one on the left, you can see Heart, San Francisco. Yes, indeed, Heart, San Francisco. Isn't that magical? Victorians in the foreground, the skyscrapers in the background. Now, these Victorians were built by the developer Matthew Cavanaugh between 1892 and 1896. And he certainly had an eye for setting. Incredible. Hard to imagine that one time these buildings were on the verge of demolition. In the distance, you see downtown San Francisco. And in between the two of them is where we're headed, the Fillmore District. The Fillmore District of the Western Addition. Now, this building on the end, right there on the end, the last painted lady, sold for more money than any painted lady in history in 2014. But right next to it, the second building in, is the one that I'm most interested in, because that was the home in the 1970s of Alice Walker, author of the amazing American novel, The Color Purple, published in 1982. I hope that Alice Walker wrote that novel, or at least part of it, in this painted lady. Wouldn't that be special? Also, she had a relationship, after she left her husband, with San Francisco's greatest singer-songwriter, in my opinion, Tracy Chapman. Yes, indeed. I'd like to think that they shared some love in this wonderful painted lady. Where's the name painted lady come from? Because Victorians, which weren't loved in the 1960s, were re-embraced by people who were like hippies and liked to paint them different colors. They reinvigorated the painted ladies, the Victorians. They gave them a renaissance. So now we're headed out of Alamo Square and down towards the Fillmore and the heart of the Western Addition. And it's important that we see these beautiful Victorians before we see what happened in the Western Addition. Now, Victorians have always been besieged for a variety of reasons. Not just political reasons, but also because a lot of people just don't like Victorians. One of the greatest San Francisco architects is Willis Polk. Willis Polk, at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, was an incredible designer of houses. And Willis Polk hated the San Francisco Victorian. He thought it was cheap and cheesy. He thought that carpenters and contractors were exploiting the pretensions of middle-class people. He wanted Victorians destroyed just on aesthetic grounds. Now, where we're headed, the Western Addition, was developed at the end of the 19th century. All kinds of people lived here at first. For two immigrant populations, the Jewish immigrant population. Jewish immigrants came to San Francisco starting in 1881 because the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander II, had been assassinated by an anarchist, just like President William McKinley. And the response of Tsar Alexander III persecute the Jewish, even though they weren't responsible at all for what happened to him. But they didn't like his liberal policies. So they launched pogroms on the Jews. The Jewish immigrants came to San Francisco. They lived in the Mission District, San Francisco, a population coming to seek opportunities was Jewish immigrants, but also Japanese immigrants. The Japanese Americans settled in Chinatown and on Ring Hill. In 1906, Chinatown addition by the ninth earthquake. So those two populations, Jewish immigrant, and moved to the Western Addition and embraced it as their home. They lived between 1880 and the Western Addition. Now, as I write on the sidewalk here, you're going to see another block of Victorians. And these Victorians go on for blocks and blocks around here. But an amazing thing is going to happen as we get deeper and deeper into the Western Addition. Now, in 1906, these two populations started moving into the Western Addition, where they joined earlier immigrant populations. A lot of Jewish Americans in San Francisco began leaving the city and moving to suburbs. The Second World War started, and a lot of the Japanese Americans, matter of fact, all of them were incarcerated because people didn't trust Japanese Americans, because now we were at war with Japan. So in this irrational move, they were all locked up in concentration camps like Monsenor and the one in Iowa. It was devastating for the Japanese American population. In 1941 and 1942, there was a small African American community in the Western Addition on Ellis Street. But more African Americans began coming here from other parts of the country to work in war factories, factories building munitions and vehicles of war for the war that was coming in Europe and the Pacific. The Japanese, who had been detained during the war, returned at the end of the war and flooded into the Western Addition, which now became overcrowded. The houses, the Victorians, have been converted into apartments, and in the estimation of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, the apartments were fire traps and overcrowded, and they determined that the entire Western Addition needed to be redone. It was a case of urban renewal. Everything needed to be destroyed and rebuilt. Now let's take a look at this intersection. It's very interesting because right here around me, I'm surrounded on most sides by Victorians. So you see Victorians across the street, and here there's a Victorian. You see the circular tower window there, and right behind me, a Victorian apartment building. But directly across the street, we begin to see, in the distance, skyscraper apartment buildings. And close to us, new structures. This is where the devastation of the Western Addition begins. Everything was flattened by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. So let's cross the street. And sadly, we will leave the Victorians behind and enter a whole new part of the city. A city that now, on this block, is defined by new structures, high-rise apartment buildings, and a lot of empty lots. What are the empty lots for? Like this one right in the foreground? They're for parking. And in the distance, we see the high-rise modern apartment buildings. And everything around me is no longer Victorian. It's ugly modern buildings. And there's a Victorian, the last gasp of the old Western Addition, right there in the corner. Amazing. Unfortunately, these were not good examples of modern architecture. They were actually quite shoddy. And a whole community was dislocated. And it wasn't just a question of Victorians being destroyed, but as I said, the people who lived in them were run out of the neighborhood by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. As they tore down houses, they did not provide new houses for the people who lived in them. Joe, can you show us the house, the picture of the Victorians? And there are the devastated Victorians of the Western Addition. Look at that. First growth redwood architecture, the best building material anywhere, turned to pulp by the bulldozers. Thousands and thousands of them, 60 blocks. Estimates range between 1,000 and 6,000 Victorians were destroyed in the Western Addition in this wholesale destruction of this neighborhood. But what about the people who lived in them? Thank you, Joe. The people who lived in them were not provided with new homes. They were just told to get lost. In other words, it was a class war. It was a development designed to favor middle class and upper class people. What was the purpose of it? To build new structures so that people could get from the Western Addition to the Civic Center and their jobs downtown. That was the purpose. And in the process, the communities that lived here were cast adrift. Not only were they lost, but their culture was lost. A whole music was lost because this was the jazz capital of the Western United States. As we saw earlier, the Harlem of the West. This is where jazz happened. Performers like Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, and Billie Holiday performed here in the Western Addition. In clubs like Jimbo's Bop City, the New Orleans Swing House, and Elvis Club. This was where jazz was found. And when the audience was decimated and the venues destroyed, that jazz community was lost forever to the Western Addition. As I ride past these buildings, you'll see they have many of the features of Victorians, the bay windows, but they're completely modern structures. They have none of the charm of the old Western Addition Victorians. This entire community was destroyed. There was outrage about this. Even at the time, people said, how can you displace people without building them new homes? But the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, under the direction of Justin Herman, just ignored the outrage. And the wholesale destruction under the plan A1 continued without abatement. We're coming up now on the centerpiece of the redevelopment of the Western Addition, and that was the expansion of Geary. Now, Geary was just a normal street before redevelopment, but as part of the centerpiece of the redevelopment plan, Geary was turned into an 8-lane superhighway in the middle of San Francisco. 8 lanes bored through the very center of the city, through the Western Addition, devastating housing and community as it went. It was designed by Vernon DeMars. I actually know Vernon DeMars. Amazing. I didn't even know he was responsible for this until recently. Vernon DeMars was an architect at UC Berkeley. He designed the building that I used to do plays in, Zoellerbach. Now, I said that Durham Studio Theater, that picture that had me and June in it, was the best theater ever. I love that theater. Well, the worst theater ever is Zoellerbach Playhouse in the Zoellerbach complex, designed by Vernon DeMars. And here we have his masterpiece. I say that facetiously. This 8-lane superhighway bored through the center of San Francisco. There it is, torn through the city, and almost always under reconstruction like it is now. Now, what was the purpose of all this? Why did he build this thing here? Well, I'll tell you. It was meant to get people living in the outer neighborhoods downtown to their jobs, and also people from the suburbs. And what it managed to do was just that. And as a result, massive traffic jams downtown. A superhighway driven through the center of a neighborhood, destroying the neighborhood so that commuters could get downtown. Now, Vernon DeMars was a very nice man, but his theater sucked. I hated it. It's all concrete. The acoustics are terrible. And worse than that, he made a real amateur's mistake. He connected the grid of the Zoellerbach Playhouse with the grid of the other theater in that complex. Now, if you're a theater person, you know a grid is where the lights are hung above the stage. Well, he connected the grid of one theater to the grid of another theater. So any noise that happened in one theater would be heard in the other theater. Now, we did a show about World War II, and we found out that if we pounded on the grid, it would make the whole theater shake. That was great, a great effect. What we didn't realize was that because the grids were connected, it also made Zoellerbach Auditorium shake. And on opening night of the show about World War II, we're all banging on the grid. Jean was in the audience. She'd help with the show. We're all banging on the grid. And all of a sudden, guess what happened? The grid in Zoellerbach Auditorium started to shake also. Well, in Zoellerbach Auditorium that night was Yo-Yo Ma on his cello. Well, he was completely drowned out by the banging on the grid in our theater. Well, he didn't mind. Yo-Yo Ma's cool. He was amused. But his producer, Robert Cole, came storming over to our theater, ended up backstage, which was full of actors dressed as soldiers with guns, and he demanded to know who was in charge. God love Vernon de Mars, but his theaters and his highways are horrifying. We're now on Post Street. And if you look across the street here, you see 2000 Post Street. 2000 Post Street was originally the Winterland. The Winterland was an ice skating rink at the beginning of the 20th century. Very popular, but then it fell into disuse. What happened then was, a number of years passed, and a man named Bill Graham, yes, Bill Graham, the famous rock and roll promoter, took over Winterland and turned it into a rock and roll venue. So music was coming back to the Western Addition, but it wasn't the jazz music. It wasn't the music of the locals and people like Billie Holiday. It was rock and roll. And it remained rock and roll throughout Winterland's course. As a matter of fact, the final concert at Winterland before it was torn down was the Grateful Dead and the Blues Brothers. Yes, but they weren't really blues or jazz brothers. They were Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, cashing in on the success of their movie, The Blues Brothers. It was torn down in 1978, and this is what was built. Big apartments stretching for blocks and blocks and blocks, where the former Winterland was, the venue for Bill Graham's rock and roll concerts. We're now headed down Post Street, where we're going to visit a notorious structure in the Western Addition. Now, June had her dilemma still. What was she going to do? Stay in the United States illegally, indefinitely? She had an idea. June had always wanted to make it in New York City. She wanted to be a costume designer in New York. So she decided, since she was illegal anyway, that she'd rather be illegal in New York. Her dream was to get into NYU, New York University, and study costume design. But she thought she had to beef up her resume. Her idea was to move to New York and work on theater in New York, off Broadway, work up her resume in New York, and then apply to NYU and be a student again, get another student visa. That was her dream. Through a friend of a friend, she made a contact and moved to an apartment with a complete stranger, somebody she never met, on Mott Street. You know that old song, Mott Street, M-O-T-T, Mott Street? That's where she lived. And she got a job in New York, an illegal job, cleaning office buildings in the middle of the night. She was an illegal office cleaner in New York. Well, we went to visit her. I'm now turning right on Fillmore Street. Now, Fillmore Street, which you see now in front of you, stretches up the hill to Pacific Heights, crosses Geary, and then heads but the two halves of the street to the highway. No longer was it a community. It was two halves of a community separated by a massive river. You're looking through the glass down onto the superhighway, racing below Fillmore Street, dividing this community. That was the legacy of Vernon DeMar's superhighway in the middle of San Francisco, dividing the Western Addition in two, and specifically Fillmore Street. In fact, three very famous Rite. To
Hey everyone, this is Joe, the man behind the curtain, chiming in because we seem to have lost John. Just stick with us though. If I know John, he'll be back. I'm getting a message that says John Fisher's network bandwidth is low. Duh, that's why we lost him.
Hello,
I'm back.
I'm back. Yay. Can you make me the primary again? Hello. Hey, Joe. Can you make me the primary again? Am I the primary?
You are now.
Hello. Thank you, Joe. Anyway, I'm back, and we're looking at these three buildings. The first of them was the Scottish Rite Temple. The Scottish Rite Temple moved from this location to a location on 19th Avenue. You can still see it today. And they left behind this beautiful, well, this isn't the beautiful building, but they left behind a beautiful 20th century building. That was bought by Jim Jones of the People's Temple. Jim Jones and his People's Temple attracted a lot of African-American members of this community who'd been dispossessed by the redevelopment agency when it devastated the Western Addition. It also attracted adherents from all over the world. Now, people don't know this, but Jim Jones was an early supporter of gay supervisor Harvey Milk. Yes, Harvey Milk was helped into office by the volunteer services of the People's Temple. Eventually, Congressman Leo Ryan of San Mateo, who was suspicious about how a lot of his constituents were being treated by the People's Temple, investigated Jim Jones. And Jim Jones and his People's Temple fled to Guyana in South America. It was there that Leo Ryan followed them. Jim Jones ordered Leo Ryan's assassination, and then he ordered his followers to commit suicide by drinking Kool-Aid. And here we have what exists in its place, the Imperial Health Spa. Now, Jim Jones's building, the former Scottish Rite Temple, eventually succumbed to the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, and it was eventually destroyed. This is what's left, the Imperial Spa. Now, right next door is a post office, but this was actually, at one time, also a famous building. This is the location of a Jewish synagogue, a beautiful building from the early 20th century. Now, when Jewish immigrants started moving out of the Western Addition into the suburbs, this synagogue combined with another synagogue, and the building sat fallow for a while. It then had a bunch of different names. It was called Theater 1839, which was its address here on Geary. It was also called the Beautiful Temple, and it was eventually called the Tony Duquette Pavilion. As these venues, it hosted a variety of performers and acts. Tina Turner performed here, Miles Davis, also Sylvester and the Cockettes, and it was an early punk venue. But probably the most interesting was Tony Duquette's Pavilion. Tony Duquette, a famous Los Angeles designer, took it over and transformed it into his tribute in beautiful fabrics and glass to the saint, Saint Francis. It was his tribute to Saint Francis. And on opening night in 1984, his goddaughter, Liza Minnelli, came here and sang. Her accompaniment was Michael Feinstein. And she sang, "I see a new sun up in a new sky, and I have a whole horizon, da 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 da." Yes, a song from her father's movie, Vincent Minnelli's The Bandwagon. Unfortunately, in 1989, Tony Duquette's pavilion burned. He stood on the sidewalk, right where we are now, crying, watching it burn. And then it succumbed later in 1989 to the Loma Prieta earthquake, and it was knocked down. What we're left with is this post office. The final wonderful early 20th century structure in this row is the Fillmore Theater, which is still here, and it is a music venue to this day. Now, the Fillmore was originally a dance hall and a dance school. Eventually, it was owned by one of the most successful African-American businessmen in this part of the city. His name was Charles Sullivan, and he used it as a music venue. And he had a lot of jazz musicians come here and play. Miles Davis, Tina Turner. Then, in 1965, he rented it to Bill Graham to have a fundraiser for the San Francisco Mime Troupe. Bill Graham loved the venue. It was more intimate than Winterland across the street. So he started using it for rock concerts, and he booked rock concerts in here for years. Occasionally, he would have blues, jazz type artists like Miles Davis and Aretha Franklin, but primarily it was rock and roll. In the 70s, it became the Muhammad Temple number 26 for the Nation of Islam. But then it became a music venue once again. Music was returning to the Western Addition. Now, on the subject of Charles Sullivan, he did sponsor a jazz club across the street here. He was the underwriter for Jimbo Edwards. Jimbo Edwards had a jazz club right across Geary here on Post Street. That was Jimbo's Pop City, where everybody performed. John Coltrane, Billie Holiday, all the greats. In the 40s, 50s, everybody came here. A very young Clint Eastwood fell in love with jazz here. Marilyn Monroe from Hollywood came here to listen to jazz. Jimbo's Bop City, though, was very hard for me to find. I couldn't find it. The address for Jimbo's Bop City was on Post Street, which is up here and to the right. But that whole part of the street had been redeveloped. It had all new buildings on it. I couldn't find Jimbo's anywhere. Then I read that it had been moved. The entire structure, a beautiful old Victorian, had been moved from Post Street around the corner onto Fillmore Street to 1712 Fillmore. So here we go, crossing the street and going up Fillmore Street to see the former home of Jimbo's Bop City, where all the great jazz performers came. Jimbo's eventually closed, and it became Marcus Books. Marcus Books was the oldest and longest running African-American bookstore in the nation, right here at 1712 Fillmore Street. And now it is Rue Salon, a hair salon. And there you can see it, this wonderful building that was moved around the corner. We're now going to head up Post Street. Post Street was the former home not only of Jimbo's, but of the New Orleans Swing House and other jazz venues. In 1968, the city finally admitted that perhaps it had done something wrong with the A1 redevelopment. And it committed itself to building a new Japantown. In a way, it was apologizing to the Japanese American community for displacing it with redevelopment, and also apologizing for incarcerating the Japanese Americans during World War II in concentration camps like Manzanar. On my right is an architect named Yamasaki's Japantown, built in a traditional manner, Japanese architecture. Japantown has shops, movie theaters, and restaurants in it. It's very popular with tourists. And as we approach, we're going to see, crossing Webster Street, a traditional Japanese-style bridge, the famous arched bridge. There you see it, soaring above Webster Street, the arched bridge of Japantown. Now, people who knew Japantown before redevelopment say that it was much more charming than this, because all the stores and restaurants and entertainment venues were in old Victorian that was unparalleled in San Francisco. Handsome as the new Japantown is, it's nothing like the old charming Victorian Japantown that was destroyed by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. So what was the redevelopment agency after? They wanted to destroy all this property so they could build high-rise apartment buildings. And here you see them in the distance. There's the Miyako Hotel, also by Yamasaki. In the distance, the Sequoias, a wealthy retirement community. There's the lovely moon soaring over San Francisco. St. Mary's Cathedral, one of the few examples of excellent modern architecture in the Western Addition. And in the distance, you can see Hill. Why on Cathedral Hill? Because it had, so the Western Addition stated, so that people could have luxury apartments and easy access to downtown. We're now coming up on the centerpiece of Japantown. This plaza, which has a pagoda in it. Well, it's not a wood pagoda, it's a concrete pagoda. But it's still pretty handsome. It's by an architect named Taniguchi, and it's the centerpiece of Japantown. And here it is, Taniguchi's pagoda. There it is, in the center of Japantown. Now, on my left is a very nice little alley that connects Post Street with the next street up. This alley is famous for its wonderful street furniture and fountains. This street furniture was designed by the incredible Ruth Asawa, a Japanese-American artist who thrived in San Francisco in the 20th century. Look at that fountain. Isn't that wonderful? There's another one here in the distance. This is all her creation. This little Japanese village in the middle of San Francisco. So sweet, so nice. And there's another fountain of hers in the distance. So Japantown, in a way, was the redevelopment agency's way of apologizing to the Japanese Americans for displacing them with redevelopment and for their internment in the concentration camps. But what about the other communities that were displaced by redevelopment? Well, some efforts were made in that direction also, as we'll see as we head back down Post Street, again towards Fillmore. We visited June, our friend, in New York City. As I said, we had dinner with her, took her to an opera, but she seemed miserable. She came back to San Francisco, and as I said, she didn't know what to do next. She was desperate. The attorney had recommended that she go to the airport and return to Singapore. If she didn't do that, she could be arrested at any moment by INS. We felt for our friend June. She continued to work with us on the projects. We kept trying to figure out an answer. What could we do? Finally, our friend Corey, the one she'd been living with, and was now living with again on Liberty Street, said that he would marry her. Now, Corey, of course, was gay, but they thought that they could concoct a green card marriage. They'd been living with each other, so they were convinced that they could convince somebody from immigration that they were a happily married couple. Well, Corey was willing. Everybody thought it was a great move. Something out of the movies, right? But unfortunately, June had been raised conservative Christian, and she just couldn't see herself marrying a man that she didn't love and never had intended to have babies with. I mean, of course, she loved Corey, but as a friend. Corey was queer, and she just didn't see herself living that kind of lie, even for the amount of time it would take to become an American citizen and stay in this country. That was not going to be a solution. We're now crossing Geary Boulevard again, this superhighway that divided Fillmore Street and the Western Addition in two. We're headed into the redeveloped Western Addition on Fillmore Street. Now, if you look in front of me, you'll see the Fillmore Theater on my right and a Victorian structure on my left. But soaring above the Victorian structure is another massive apartment building. And that is the last Victorian that you will see for a while in this neighborhood. Also, the Fillmore Theater. Old, but the last older structure that you will see in this area for a while. Now, as an effort to bring music back to the Western Addition, this building on my right here, is the Boom Boom Room. And in 1997, the musician John Lee Hooker opened this club. Now, it wasn't exclusively jazz, blues, and soul. It was all kinds of things. But it is successful, and it did bring music back to this neighborhood. Here we see a mural on the side, which is a celebration of the Fillmore as a musical neighborhood, the Boom Boom Room. Another effort to bring music back was the Jazz Festival. But the Jazz Festival wasn't a year-round venue. It was just something that happened at a certain time of the year. So how was music going to be brought back to this neighborhood year-round? That was the quandary. So we're now on Fillmore Street in the Western Addition. It's been rebuilt. There are restaurants here. Some of them are even open now. There's a grocery store with a big parking lot, but all the architecture is new. There's nothing old. The Victorians that grace this community have been destroyed. The community that lived here is gone, displaced. Because there were no houses for them to replace, they had to go to other places, other cities, to Hunters Point. The community was dislocated. Here, at the center of it, is the Fillmore Center, right here. And this place holds a poignant place in my heart. There you see a sculpture, a tribute to the jazz legacy of the Fillmore. And behind it Corey lived in, where June was no longer in sight. I went to visit him, and there was no June. So this building holds a special poignancy for me, because it was here that I really realized that June was gone. She had gotten on a plane and returned to Singapore. Corey lived here with Paul, and June had gone back to Singapore. And a significant member of our artistic and emotional family was gone. This is very interesting, this sculpture, as a tribute to the jazz legacy of the Fillmore District. There's a lot of things like this in this neighborhood. Right here, next to the Fillmore Center, is Sheba Jazz, a lounge and restaurant. Right there. So where's the actual jazz in this neighborhood? What happened to it? Well, an effort was made to bring jazz back to the Fillmore. And that effort was to bring in the experts. A famous jazz venue in the East Bay is Yoshi's. Yoshi's is located at Jack London Square and has always been a big success in East Bay. The Yoshi's people were to come to the Fillmore and set up a Yoshi, which would be of the United States west of Chicago. And here is where Yoshi's was located. You see this big sign? That says Yoshi's. But right now it's covered with a big sock that says the Addition. Because what happened was Yoshi's didn't survive. Yoshi's was here in San Francisco from 2007 to 2014, but it just couldn't make a go of it. It was here in the Fillmore Heritage Center, the center of tribute to jazz and the lost community of the Fillmore. In 2015, the Addition, taking its name from the Western Addition, took over in an effort to keep the jazz playing in this neighborhood. But it too lasted only 3 months. It didn't survive, and the jazz left this street. As you go down the street, you'll see other remembrances of jazz in the Western Addition. Here is a salon, which has taken the name Jazz Z. Sidewalk that commemorate famous jazz artists who performed here in San Francisco in this community. Here's one right here. This is Vince Guaraldi, and he played the piano at Jimbo's Bop City. Also, across the street at the former Josie's, there are pictures of great jazz legends on the facade. They're there. Unfortunately, as I said, in 2015, the Addition shut up shop and left this building. Yoshi's is still in the East Bay and going strong, but not here on Fillmore Street. Of course, the reflection is, how can you devastate a community, destroy it with redevelopment and urban renewal, catchphrases for imperialism and destruction, favoring upper middle class and upper class people over the people who made this community great, devastate a community like that, and expect its culture to continue. It's as simple as opening up huge jazz venues many years after the communities have been driven away. One more stop. 1286 Fillmore Street. 1286 Fillmore is a former location of one of our first stops, the John Coltrane Church, which used to be right here on Fillmore Street. Here it is. 12 Institute moved up the hill to Turk Street, where it is, under the Fillmore. So what happened? Well, communities were devastated. The San Francisco never returned. Eventually, eight of the prevents eventually the destruction of further Victorians and the
Uh-oh. Getting the message again that John's network bandwidth is low. How low can he go?
Hey, Joe, am I back?
You are back.
Hello, hello. And am I spotlighted?
You are now spotlighted.
Thank you, Joe. Well, the communities have been dispersed, but not entirely, because eventually community activism, just as in the highway destruction brought Southern Pacific Hospital, stopped those destructions in West took on the redevelopment agency and stopped the wholesale destruction of the Victorians and the displacement of many of the community members. Not nearly in the numbers that had occupied these neighborhoods before, but they stopped the displacement. Now buildings couldn't be built unless new homes were found for the occupants before the buildings of the former were destroyed. And many Victorians were preserved. And these neighborhoods might come back one day, but right now they still live in the wake of urban renewal and redevelopment. Examples of San Francisco imperialism at its worst. So, June, my costume designer and collaborator, had returned to Singapore. I haven't seen her in a long time. We exchanged emails and phone calls for a while, but we fell out of touch. The last time I heard from her was on September 11th, 2001. I was desperate because Michael had gone off to work, my lovely husband, and I needed somebody to hold me. I missed Michael desperately on 9/11. I kept calling him at the library, calling him, wanting him to call me back, leaving messages. Suddenly the phone rang. I answered it, and it was June. June calling from Singapore to check up on me, to see how I was doing. How lovely. We had a very brief conversation because I wanted to hang up and talk to Michael, but it was lovely to hear her voice. Then Michael called me, and somehow I made it through the day. After that, June and I pretty much fell out of touch. I heard that she'd spent some time in London, which I thought was wonderful, but I think she went back to Singapore. I asked her if he stayed in touch with her. He said no. He said that he did get occasional notices from her, postings on Facebook. I said, oh, were they about her husband, her kids? In the theater? Postings. Always things about Christianity. I just hope that she's embraced a form of Christianity that is inclusive, that accepts diversity, socially, culturally, sexually. And I dreamed that one day I would go to Singapore and see June. About a year and a half ago, my husband and I saw the movie Crazy Rich Asians, which was a pretty good movie. It was all filmed in Singapore. And it reignited in us an interest in that country. I knew a lot of people who had gone there. They said they loved it. They said the food was incredible, amazing contemporary architecture. They loved Singapore. So we started looking into it. And then I realized that in Singapore, homosexuality is illegal. If you're caught having sex, you could be thrown in jail for 2 years. Well, Michael and I go to countries like that. Not so much because we think we'll be arrested. We know they probably won't arrest us. I mean, they want our money. Why would they arrest guys? They want our money. But we don't like to support countries that disapprove of us because we feel like they want it both ways. They want our tourist dollars, but they can't be bothered to us. So if I wonder if I'll see my wonderful June ever again. She was really terrific. She was a part of a great artistic and emotional collaboration in my life. And I sorely miss her. I also miss parts of this city I knew nothing about. The Victorians in these communities were displaced long before I came here. But I feel their ghosts, just as I feel the ghosts of lost friends from years gone by. Well, that's been my adventure around San Francisco and into the Fillmore. Thank you so much for joining me. You were on YouTube and Zoom since the beginning of Shelter in Place. We've always had one, sometimes 2 or 3. We have another coming up. It's a reading of a very funny play called Other Letters, which is sort of a gay love letters. You know that play, Love Letters? Well, this is a gay love letters. It's on Tuesday night at 7. It's free, so sign up for that, please. If you'd like to support Theater Rhinoceros and all of our online programming, which is all free, you can make a donation on our website at therhino.org. That's THERHINO.org. Or by sending us a check at my COVID-19 office, John Fisher, Theater Rhinoceros, 91 Central Avenue, Suite number 102, San Francisco, California, 94117. That's it for tonight. As you drive around San Francisco, think about all that was lost and think about how preservation is so important because there are so many wonderful things in this city and they can disappear in the blink of an eye. It's only people that will prevent the imperialism of the power. Good night.